handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2 1. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie, 4 7 tree 9er 8 9er out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck. 2 rounds HEBT. Gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. As we're kind of winding down the month of, I guess, Human Trafficking Awareness Month, I wanted to bring in one more expert on the topic and see if we can't not only maintain some chatter about this in January, but I want it to be on the top of everybody's heads in the listening world. So Dr. Kimberley Mehlman Orozco has been gracious enough to accept the invitation to be with us on the Denise Simon Experience, and she is the author of a book titled Hidden in Plain Sight. Kimberley kind of dedicated an awful lot of time and energy and resources and research and interviews and whatnot to the topic of human trafficking. It certainly comes in all forms. So Dr. Kimberley, thanks for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
As I just kind of said, human trafficking really comes in all forms. It has many shapes to it. And I think that from the listening audience perspective, we just think it has to do with sex trafficking, and that's not the case at all, is it?
No, definitely not. In fact, I mean, we have two overarching forms of trafficking that we'll see, so sex trafficking and labor trafficking, but underneath those umbrella categories, we do have multiple different ways in which this crime manifests. And actually, my book, each chapter talks about those different forms. So under the umbrella category of sex trafficking, for example, you could have domestic sex trafficking, gang-controlled sex trafficking, international sex trafficking. You can have adult sex tourism, child sex tourism, military sex tourism, and you can see it in erotic massage parlors. In fact, sometimes you can see commercial sex services exchanged in nail salons, in the back rooms of nail salons. So there are a lot of different ways and businesses in which serve as a veneer for the commercial sex trade. Underneath the umbrella form of labor trafficking, you can have domestic servants, door-to-door salespeople, undocumented persons who are being smuggled across the border and then found in traffic situations, for example, in restaurants or bars, or other businesses. You can have legal non-immigrants or temporary immigrants coming and being exploited in the agricultural industry. We know that there are labor trafficking situations that might not happen here in the United States. Those were a few, that do happen here, but we do also import a lot of goods that can be found being made by either child victims of labor trafficking or adults. And some industries include the chocolate industry, as well as textiles that are being imported into the United States. So one of the things that I say in my book, and when I speak a lot, I'll say each person in this room, each one of your listeners has used, consumed, touched a product of slavery at multiple points in their life, and we continue to do so unless something changes.
Kimberley, I mean, we have found that a lot of these migrants, these refugees from quote unquote Syria, have been scooped up by mafia types in the coastline of Italy, where they have been put into labor camps, if you will. So, I mean, we know that North Korea has exploited North Koreans, that their labor has been sold to Russia, where they build buildings like they did for the Sochi Olympics. They have been sent to Qatar to build the stadiums for the upcoming World Cup. There's a lot of them that are in Africa that are working in labor camps there. And I would even argue that, as you say too, here in the United States, I mean, when it comes to the agriculture business, but some of these other countries like China, they're also sending Chinese into the United States for very much the same reason. I think that out there in the Pacific side of the country, they're working in really tough conditions. And is anybody in your travels, Kimberly, when you're interviewing the law enforcement side or the Department of Homeland Security side, those kinds of officials, they're aware of it, but is that a priority, or it's on the list but not on the short list?
Well, in my work and serving on task forces and attending conferences and other types of presentations and engagements where I would encounter service providers and law enforcement agents, I think that most of them that I do meet are very impassioned, but I think that they about addressing the issue, no matter the form. But I think that they are resource deprived. I think that there isn't enough resources that are being allocated to address this issue, and those that are being allocated, in my opinion, are not necessarily being spent in the right place. And for that reason, I think that they do face a number of barriers to successful intervention. And because of those barriers, I have seen instances where law enforcement can become a bit jaded to the topic and feel that their interventions are futile, and after a while might not necessarily investigate or go after these types of cases as zealously as they would have done initially. A good example of that is there was a number of stories about a quote-unquote erotic massage parlor in a suburb of my hometown of Annandale that was featured in a number of stories in the Washington Post and was being touted by law enforcement, both federal and local, as a successful intervention with their human trafficking task force. The name of the business was Peach Therapy. It was federally prosecuted, but 3 months after the prosecution, Washington Post reporter Tom Jackman went back to that exact same location, knocked on that exact same door, and a woman in hot pants and heavy makeup opened the door and, kind of alluded to the fact that it was still up and running. In fact, this was several years ago. To this day, a massage parlor under now a different name, but in that exact same location with the exact same business phone number, is still in operation, and they are posting advertisements for their business in the Women for Men dating section of Backpage.com. Again, kind of suggestive that they are continuing, that they may be continuing and engaging in the type of activity that was supposedly addressed with that intervention back in 2013. So I think law enforcement is aware of this. I think that they are aware that they're posting those advertisements. I think, though, it's very difficult to successfully intervene. And for that reason, investigations are typically very time-consuming. They really do take their time. And sometimes you don't even see, any type of meaningful intervention come to fruition.
The remarkable part is that, Kimberly, we read these things in the headline. This operation happened by, the marshals and local law enforcement and FBI and whatever else. And we go, okay, good. They caught, 200 people. But you're the one that follows it all the way to the end, and we think it is the end. We know that, it's going to go through trial and these people are going to go to jail, and that's not always the case, is it?
No, it's definitely not. And that's actually one of the things that I made a point to do in my book is really take the reader behind the headlines of human trafficking cases here in the United States. So when you see a headline that says, 150 sex traffickers arrested and 100 human trafficking victims rescued, I want to say, I follow those cases to say, okay, well, what happens post-arrest? What happens after a victim is quote-unquote rescued? And what I find when you do follow those cases, a lot of the times, not always, but a lot of the times, you will see the quote-unquote offenders that are being suggested to be sex traffickers. Many of them are not being charged with with sex trafficking. They're being charged with tangentially related crimes like prostitution or pimping and pandering, which carry, much lighter sentences. And those who are charged with sex trafficking often plead down to tangentially related offenses that carry, again, a slap on the hand type of sentence. Post-rescue, also we'll see victims that will be denied services, erroneously criminalized, re-victimized, and oftentimes find themselves back in a similar situation after they're quote-unquote rescued. One of the reasons being is, again, going back to that resource deprivation, we don't have enough residential placement facilities. Those residential placement facilities where these victims can live post-rescue oftentimes aren't solely dedicated to sex trafficking survivors. Sometimes they also provide services to multiple other populations and don't necessarily have the expertise to provide trauma-informed care to a victim of sex trafficking, which, there is a lot of trauma. There are a lot of things they need to work through. Moreover, if you've been trafficked for 10 years, you need additional services to help get yourself to a point of independence and ability to thrive. So we need to see vocational training, trauma-informed therapy, medical treatment, dental treatment. Sometimes they've been arrested for things related to their victimization. So a sex trafficking victim might have convictions on her record for prostitution, despite the fact that she was sex trafficked the entire time. So in some states, she would need legal assistance if they have a vacator statute, which would allow for an expungement. There's just so many barriers to a successful quote-unquote rescue and a successful arrest that, and it's not law enforcement's fault, because I think that they do as much as they can. But what the public doesn't understand is that there's a reason why you see more stories about these quote-unquote arrests and rescues versus success stories of a victim, 10, 15 years down the line, and stories about convictions, is because they're farther and fewer between.
It's an ugly world. It's an ugly, ugly world. Let's talk about the traffickers themselves. They are not. They come in various forms too. They can be very well educated, they can be pillars of the community, or they can be gang members. So they kind of run the whole spectrum. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I think, when somebody might envision, so in my classes when I teach, I'll ask, my students to close their eyes and envision a criminal or envision a law-abiding citizen. I think when we envision or imagine who a human trafficker is, what comes to mind a lot of the times is somebody out of the movie Taken, like a gun-wielding Albanian mobster, which was like a clearly bad guy, and you can tell the bad guys from the good guys, and it's just kind of very clear-cut. In my experience, it's very different. I've interviewed a number of convicted human traffickers, and whether they're formally educated or not, typically they're very cunning and manipulative, and for their level of education, they are typically very well spoken. They can convince somebody of something that might not necessarily be true to coerce them into an exploitive situation. So one of the sex traffickers I interviewed, one of the tactics that he used was compartmentalizing information. So he would never let his victims, he would always kind of pit them against each other and would never let them know the whole story and not allow them to communicate. And to explain that to me, he said, I never let my left hand know what my right is doing. very cunning, but it really did paint a picture of one of the tactics that they use. Typically, a novice sex trafficker, for example, they are more likely to use physical force, kidnapping, and brute force. And they can still use that if they're tenured or have been experienced in trafficking individuals, but it's more, you see that more frequently with somebody who's newer. Somebody who's experienced at trafficking, they are so skilled and manipulative that they can really kind of convince their victim into an almost complacent situation. The way that I explain is more of it's a invisible tether versus a physical chain. They've manipulated this person so much that even when their trafficker is not around, and even if they have the opportunity to call 911, they won't do that just because of how threatened or mentally manipulated or coerced and deceived they've been. And so, as far as human traffickers, and again, depending on the type of trafficking, you're going to see different tactics that being used. But in my experience in interviewing different convicted traffickers, despite having formal education or not, they are extremely intelligent, and I think that's one of the reasons why they've chosen their illicit activity to be human trafficking, because they know that they can exploit a huge amount of profit, and the risk is much lower than other forms of organized crime.
Well, there's a profit component in this, Kimberly, but there's not necessarily, others have some kind of a wickedness about them, that it's not really a profit center for these individuals, for these criminals, but it's a habit or just some kind of a game to it. Is that right?
I mean, in my experience, I think the major motivator for them has been always money. But I think what you're articulating, I have seen as well, because they almost universally, they don't see individuals, they don't see people. They see human beings as a means to an end. How can I use that person? And I think that viewpoint of how can I use an individual as a tool to get me what I want, I think that does facilitate their crime. And I think it is also one of the personality traits that is definitely prominent in the types of individuals who I've interviewed.
A couple of years ago, you may or may not know about this, it came across my radar when we had that, what they referred to as the beast train, that was bringing in all of these children and people from Mexico into the United States. They were all piled on these trains and on top of the trains and whatnot. And it came to my attention that there were factions of the darker part of our society that, we were necessarily trying to find homes for these kids. Then we're moving them from one place to another, and we couldn't, and we did, and they did. And there were segments that said, hey, I'll take, 2 or 3 of these kids, and I'll be their guardian, and I'll be this, and I'll be that. But as it turns out, in some of those cases, they ended up in being slave labor or in, a sex trade themselves. Were you able to follow any of that phenomenon?
I did not follow that specific case or incident, but at the same time, I have identified a number of cases where human smuggling situations with persons crossing the border, without documentation or illegally, turn into human trafficking situations, because again, they're highly exploitable, they're non-citizens, they don't know their rights, they might not speak their language, and I have seen a pattern of that type of human trafficking situation manifesting, especially with unaccompanied minors. I mean, they don't have anybody else, they don't have their family, they might not even know how to contact their family back home, and it really does open up for the possibility of exploiting an already marginalized population.
We also have a male component. We kind of think that this all has to do with just females. It doesn't, does it?
Oh, no, definitely not. I think that we've seen incidents of human trafficking, both labor and sex trafficking involving men, but especially labor trafficking. I mean, in a lot of labor trafficking situations, you are seeing young boys and men being exploited. And again, it's hard for people to understand why, a young, able-bodied man who might have the opportunity to escape from that type of situation doesn't. But the manipulation, the debt bondage is, a very clear tactic that's used, making them think that they're indebted and constantly accruing debt, but they always have this sort of light at the end of the tunnel after a certain amount of time. Oh, you'll be able to make money. You'll be able to, to send money back home. You'll be able to, live a more sustainable life. But once that time comes, it comes and goes, and there's always something else adding to their debt. And it is a form of mental manipulation that does lead and facilitate this type of exploitation. But young men, young boys are often found to be victims of human trafficking, especially labor trafficking.
Can you, you alluded to it a little bit about the victims. We're clearly not prepared to handle these victims, but they kind of come in all forms. Can you, maybe we ought to say survivors.
Yes.
Talk about them a little bit, if you would.
Well, I mean, human trafficking survivors, they do come in all forms. So you have women, men, you have persons of different socioeconomic statuses, as well as sexual orientations. I mean, it really runs the gamut. One of the things that I found, though, is there are certain segments of the population that are at higher risk of being pulled in. And specifically, I'd like to conceptualize it using Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs essentially says, we're all motivated by the same things. And once we achieve those things, we kind of move up the hierarchy to pursue and be motivated by something else. And at the very base level, we're motivated by meeting our physiological needs, meaning that, we're looking for shelter, water, food, so on and so forth. And at that very base level, if you're having a hard time meeting those base needs, if you're food insecure, housing insecure, if you're a runaway, those types of needs or voids in your life can be easily exploited. If you're impoverished, easily exploited by somebody who's a trafficker who's, making the false promise to fulfill those needs and giving you the opportunity for upward social mobility. At the next level, we were all motivated by a need for safety. And so for that, if somebody's being abused at home, a survivor of domestic violence or child abuse, they might be motivated by the false promise of a human trafficker to protect them. So like I said, tenured or experienced human traffickers might be less apt to use physical force. They use more mental manipulation, coercion, threat. I mean, they still might use physical force, but it might be more further in between or more rare for them to do that if they're a skilled manipulator. And so they might make the false promise to provide you with a greater amount of safety than you've experienced in the past. I've literally heard human trafficking survivors tell me that, yes, I was being beaten, I was being exploited, but at least I had a roof over my head and food in my stomach. And so I think that's a sad testament to our society for any human being to think that being trafficked is improvement to their life. But a lot of them do explain that, it was an improvement despite being victimized. At the next level, we all seek love and belonging. And that's why there's a domestic sex trafficker known as a Romeo pimp. And a lot of them do, are boyfriends or love interests or pretend to be, and use that false feeling of love and belonging and family and unity to coerce and deceive their victim into a situation of exploitation, because we're all motivated by that need for love and belonging. At the next level is esteem. And so you'll see traffickers that'll sometimes build up a woman's self-esteem just to tear it back down and build it up again. And that's another tactic for control and exploitation. And at the very last, it's self-actualization. And so human traffickers can, in some instances, make the false promise to fulfill maybe somebody who's coming from a great family, but maybe she has a dream that she's having a hard time actualizing. For example, maybe she wants to be a model or an actress or a singer or whatever the case may be. A human trafficker can often pretend to be the conduit to her actualizing their dreams. So they could be a modeling agency or an agent, or drive around in a fancy car and claim to know celebrities, or have a foot in the door within the entertainment industry. But it's all just a ruse to get them to away from their social support system, and a ruse to get them into an exploitable situation.
You use two great words, conduit and ruse. They are key words. Remarkable work here, Dr. Kimberley Mehlman Orozco, author of Hidden in Plain Sight. There is no community across the country that is immune or protected from this phenomenon. And in the spirit of teaching more to the listening audience, I suggest that you grab this book, Hidden in Plain Sight. Kimberley is also can be found on C-SPAN because she's done some book discussions and remarkable work, and we're just so gratified that you're here with us on the Denise Simon Experience. I hope you have some great success with this book and this messaging. I know I'm just so very annoyed with this whole scandal, and I don't know, that's not even the right word, but it's affecting, I think, the mindset, because we're becoming desensitized to some of the ugliness that's in the country, and I would say across the world. So I may call on you again, because I don't want to let this topic go away, and I want your message to resonate. So excellent work, Dr. Kimberley Mehlman Orozco, and please come back.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
All right. More coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us.
Hi, thank you for listening. My name is Ron Phillips, and I'm the owner and operations manager of Talk America Radio. It is with great pride that I offer you these two 24/7 streams of some of the finest talk radio programming in the country, but I need your support. Talk America Radio is a listener-supported network. That means we need your help to continue to offer the quality programming you're hearing right now. Please visit talkamericaradio.us and click the Support Us button. You can contribute monthly or send us a one-time amount. We'll put it to good use continuing to share the American voice. Thank you.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Hi, this is Captain Matt Bruce from the Captain's America Third Watch, and you're listening to Talk America Radio, the new dominant force in conservative talk radio.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia.
And Don Newen from Cowboy Logic Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't go to sleep every night completely fatigued from trying to restore America from the destruction that is taking place,
then you're simply not doing enough. Join us every Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, for Cowboy Logic Radio.
let the restoration begin.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
KTA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia. And WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. I got the distinct pleasure of having Fred Gedrich with us, who was a previous guest and kind of a distant buddy that I call on from time to time. He's a foreign policy and national security analyst, and he actually has a resume that supports that because he served in the U.S. State Department and in the Department of Defense, and has traveled extensively on assignments when he was in government. And the reason we invited Fred today is because there was this big firestorm last week about some disputed, derogatory remark that Trump had made, with a bunch of, members of Congress about some countries, whether it was Africa or Haiti, we don't know. But Fred decided that he was going to address that, and he did so with a very good article that he wrote at Breitbart. And so I tapped him on the shoulder, and Fred decided that he would join us on the Denise Simon Experience so we could expand on that, because there are reasons to have derogatory remarks on some of these countries. So with that, Fred, thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Denise, delighted to be with you again today.
Thank you. I'm really happy that there's a lot of moving parts, Fred, and when it comes to foreign policy and countries out there. We watched several countries in the last several years where they should have been stable countries or could have been stable countries, and we watched one right after another go into an absolute tailspin, most of which I would say one is in our hemisphere that just went completely off the rails, and that's Venezuela. Mm-hmm. And so if any derogatory remark could have been applied, it could have been applied there. But the African Union, I think, has got 50 plus member countries in it. And I would argue that very few of them are necessarily what we would call one stable or two free countries. Is that right, Fred?
Right. It's quite an interesting continent. In this piece, I focused on Africa, and I'm currently writing a piece on Haiti, which has a lot of similar problems, but Haiti's located in the Western Hemisphere, so I decided to break it up. And I had the opportunity during my career in the State Department to travel extensively to a number of African countries and see firsthand a lot of the problems they have. And I also, during the embargo in the early 90s, I had the opportunity to go to Haiti as well, and talk about an eye-opener. That close to the United States in that bad of condition, it really shocks the conscience, both in Africa and in Haiti. But to make the article flow a lot easier, I focused my first article on Africa. And the African Union, they tout themselves as an organization that's built for the benefit of the African people. And it was founded by the late Libyan dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. And that tells you a lot right from the start. And then what I tried to do is measure how successful they've been in the last 20 or so years in improving the lot of the ordinary African lives. Now, what I will say, the biggest problems I noticed in Africa is not necessarily with the people. I had the opportunity and honor to go in a lot of the villages, and they didn't care if you were Republican or Democrat. You were an American, and they really treated me nice. And I have some nice pictures of being in groups of villagers, and they were just dying to get in the picture. And my heart goes out to them. The problem is the leadership in almost all the countries over there leaves a lot to be desired. And unfortunately, all the riches of Africa and all the aid that pours in for the various crises, the wars, the genocide, and diseases that have raked the continent for so many years, it doesn't always find its way to the people who need it most.
Imagine
because
that.
The greedy leaders, they hold on to the money or they take their part of it. And it's a never-ending cycle. And in a lot of cases, it's vicious. Now, the other phenomenon that has been occurring in Africa is the expansion of Islam, even into sub-Saharan Africa. And I guess you can go into Nigeria to prove that point. Nigeria, at 190 million people, is the most populous country in Africa. And yet 50% of the population is now Muslim. 40% is Christian, and there's a never-ending battle there between the Christians and the Muslims for control of the government. Unfortunately, in Nigeria, you have a group called Boko Haram, one of the most deadliest terror groups in the world, radical Islamist terror group, that uses violence to achieve their goals. And a few years ago, you may recall the schoolgirls who were kidnapped, and a lot of them have never, seen the light of day again. They've the way the sex trafficking works and slavery works. It's hard for them to get away. I did have the opportunity shortly after that incident. Hudson Institute had one schoolgirl who had escaped the clutches of Boko Haram, and I got to see her speak, and she was terrified because it was so close to the experience, and I could just imagine the poor other schoolgirls that went through their capture and what still must be going through their minds, because they didn't get away, most of them. And the U.S. government at that time, I think, between Michelle Obama and President Obama, with this hashtag diplomacy, Boko Haram just laughed at that. But anyway, the Africa as a whole is suffering so many different things, and I try to chronicle them in the piece. And when you look at it, and I'll recite a few of the problems they have. Freedom House, that's a global freedom watchdog that's been around since the 1940s, and they try to monitor democracy all over the world. And in the case of Africa, the 54 countries, it's and 1.2 billion residents, only 126 million, that's 10%, live in freedom, that have anything similar to political rights and civil liberties that free world citizens have, like us in our, in this country. And that's shocking at first, but then you go through the rest of the information, you find the average lifespan for 1.2 billion people, they can expect to live 57 years versus 75 years for the rest of the world. The U.S. is 80 years. We're one of the, we're really fortunate groups of people in the world who have, fairly substantial lifespan. But then you look at Africans' GDP. The rest of the planet, excluding the 54 countries, it's something on the order of $18,000 per capita, the average annual income. In Africa, it's less than $5,000. And in Africa, that's disproportionate between the upper class and the majority of people in the lower class. So you can imagine the people living on less than $2 and $1 a day. It's in the millions, and it's just terrible. And when you travel into the villages and you see the rampant poverty, it's heartbreaking, because you can't really help the people, on a personal mission. And but you try to do your best. And from my standpoint, I look at it that through my writing, maybe I could, in a way, present to the American people and the general free world public how bad things are in Africa, despite this hundreds of, billions of dollars that have been invested in Africa over the years. And then the work, one of the most heartbreaking things of all is the illiteracy rate. And you look at that and you see, and we're talking about people over the age of 15 who can't read or write. 37% of the population in Africa can't read or write over the age of 15. Compare the world's 9%. And that is really, it's worse than heartbreaking, because what it means is we're at least a generation or two for being able to educate the public and then institute government reforms and institutions that'll improve their lot, that they could be proud of their local communities, their states, and their countries. And it's an epic job just trying to, comprehend the problem and then trying to do something about it constructively. And then you look across the landscape in Africa, and you're looking at civil wars, genocide, anarchy, and this has been going on for decades. Angola, Congo, Libya, Mozambique, Nigeria, Rwanda, Somalia, and Sudan. That's killed, displaced, and ruined the lives of tens of millions of people. And then the other thing is, I went through the CIA World Factbook, and I meticulously, one of the things I want to look for, I was aware of the AIDS epidemic because most of the AIDS cases in the world are in Africa. But the other diseases, in which places them in the very high risk category, the major infectious diseases, 36 countries with 945 million people have a high risk to major infectious disease. And you look at that and you think, okay, what was President Trump really trying to get at? And, if you include terrorism and you include all these diseases, you want
illiteracy.
Illiteracy. You want to open the doors to our country to people, who can contribute, and you want to do the humanitarian thing. But what you can't do is bring
daunting.
people into the country that don't want to adhere to our Constitution or our laws. Islam, 42% of the population, they advocate Sharia law, which is incompatible with our way of living and our law, our Constitution. And from the disease standpoint, almost anybody you bring in to our country on a humanitarian or legal immigration basis has to be subjected to some type of health exam. Because if they're carrying major diseases, infectious diseases, you want to at least be able to identify them. And does that mean that you're cruel? Not necessarily. I think it's a matter of trying to protect the people of the United States. And I think that's what President Trump's up against.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, I think where we've gone as a country in terms of politics is I think we have one party who is striving to bring in as many immigrants as possible for voting purposes. And then you have people from another major party who are more interested in national security. What we have here. There is common ground, but you have to really exercise due care. Now, I wouldn't use the word that was attributed to President Trump, and that's been disputed by him and several others in the meeting. But I think Americans have to really search the dictionary to come up with a word to describe most of the country, Africa. and I think for shock value, what it did for me is at least caused me to go in and do an analysis, methodically go through country by country and look at the statistics and data and try to make sense of it. And you say, well, there's a point to be made here, and we have to be careful on who we let into the country. And I think that's what President Trump is doing, and I give him credit for that. And those who use the bad language, I wouldn't use it, but there are terms that would apply.
Well, but here's the other interesting component, Fred, and that is, I mean, when you began speaking on this, you were just talking too about the corruption and the dictators and the kleptocracies and the tyrants, their political systems. I mean, we know just from looking at those leaders themselves that, any negative adjective that you would apply to these people is aptly applied, right?
Yeah, and look what happened in Libya, for instance, when the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton deserves a lot of credit for what happened there. they decide they're going to show how you intervene in a country because they were opposed to what President George Bush did in Iraq. They're going to do it the right way. So they go in, they remove a dictator who had cobbled together a coalition, and he was a dictator. But what President Obama and Secretary Clinton left us with is an unmitigated disaster. It's not even a country anymore. It's a failed state. And we're talking, I didn't even get into the trafficking of persons in Africa. You know, when you go through and you look at the 54 countries, and you find out that all 54 of them have some type of problem with modern slavery. And you do have a block of them that are trying to do something about it. You have another block that would like to do something about it, but they have a long way to go. And then you have probably 1/3 of the country who's doing absolutely nothing about it, and promoting it. And in fact, in Libya, you probably saw a week or two ago where there was a report of slaves being sold on the market publicly.
Yes.
And a lot of these people are poor migrants because the conditions are so poor in the countries they live in. They travel north and they get caught in a situation where people who do engage in slavery take advantage of them for any number of reasons, whether it be servitude or whether it's sexual exploitation. And it's unfortunate, but it is happening, and it's happening at a terrifying level to children. And it's just sad, and it breaks your heart when you read all about that. And in that regard, I would commend people that are listening who want to know more about it. The U.S. State Department's Trafficking in Persons report is one of the best in the world because it breaks down and it'll tell you, the countries that actually have laws and enforce those laws against modern day slavery. But it also shows you the ones in the middle and then the terrible ones. And then there's 3 states. It's Libya, Somalia, and Yemen, which isn't in Africa, but it's nearby, that they can't even get in there to do any examinations because they're failed states and civil wars are ongoing, and it's just conditions just don't,
Now, Fred, when the State Department collects that data, for instance, you just mentioned the Trafficking in Persons report. How does the State Department collect that data? Where does it necessarily come from? Is it coming from ambassadors? Is it coming from?
Well, in Africa, nearly every one of the 54 countries. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of. We have missions there, that embassies, consulates, and then we have missions affiliated with UN organizations. But anyway, we have staffs there, and when it's safe, and they're the ones that go out and they collect all the information from various reports, and they assimilate all this data and they report back to Washington. Now, when they're doing that work, it's not just limited to trafficking in persons. They do other things, economic and security and all that type of information gathering, and transmit it back to DC, and then the powers that be and the various agencies work it over, and they produce their own internal reports, and there are a lot of classified reports that you can't really disclose to the public because they have the label on them: confidential, secret, top secret, and even higher than that. And
then what's the role of CIA?
Oh, well, they're in the intelligence gathering.
And, so, do they have generally some kind of presence, or is some of this data bounced off of them because they have chased somebody, or they happen?
I don't want to go into too much detail, but there's a presence all over the world in all the countries, and
all right.
and they do their own thing, but it's important because it's not only our country that does that; all the other countries do it too. Even the poor bad countries have their own intelligence agencies, and And it's funny at times to see them working hand in hand with each other. And it's just something. But then again, humanity dictates that, if you're striving for the betterment of mankind, then you work together when you can. And hopefully not only for the national interest, but for the interest of everyone. Because ideally, you'd like to see everyone living in peace, everyone living in good health, and everyone trying to live in harmony. I know that's practically impossible, but it doesn't hurt to try. And I think that's how we wind up with all the different alliances all over the globe.
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating thing because, I mean, you can go from the sublime to the ridiculous in the same continent. I mean, you can look at Benin, or you can look at Cote d'Ivoire, or you can look at South Africa, or you can look at Libya. And it's really quite fascinating. You've got Sudan, Rwanda. I mean, there's like zero continuity. In the entire continent, is there?
Well, it's tricky. Even in a place like South Africa, who many view as one of the better places in all of Africa, you have your different cities where crime is really, really bad. And I'll tell you a little story. And I was heading on assignment to Mozambique, and to get there, this was in the 90s. I had a transit through Johannesburg, and the way the flights are in Africa, sometimes you have to wait a day or two to get your connecting flight. So my colleague and I were laid over, and so we thought we would do something that would be relatively safe. We went downtown shopping in Sunday afternoon with a lot of people in one of the safest part of towns. And we were just walking along, enjoying the beautiful day that it was. And I felt a tap on my back. I turned around, which almost anyone would do when they get tapped on the back by a stranger. And I looked into a dagger staring me right in the face. And what they wanted was my backpack that contained some of my valuables. And he took the knife, and it wasn't one person. It's the way they did it. There was 4 persons. One each grabs your arm. The guy with the dagger took the dagger and he cut the backpack off my back, cut me right down the back, and then walked away with it. And the same thing happened to my colleague who was alongside me. There was actually 8 attackers. And this is a broad daylight, a popular shopping area with a lot of people around, and not one person raised a finger to help.
No.
Yeah, and when that happens to you, you realize you better be aware of your surroundings wherever you go. And the good part of the story is we survived.
Yeah, I would say.
The dangerous part is after we met with the security people at the U.S. consulate there, they said we were lucky to survive because Africa not only has a high crime rate, they have a high murder rate, and they don't think nothing of killing the people they attack, whether they're black or white. We just happen to be targets, and we got caught up in it. But that goes to show you how in one instant your life can change just like that, and how vulnerable you may be. And,
well, Fred, hold that thought. We're going to come into a break, and on the other side, I want to talk about all of the work that does go on in these countries and what is working and what isn't. So stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be right back.
You can't handle the truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
suppress, Mike Charlie 4 tree 5 9er 2-1, grid to mark, Mike Charlie 4-7 tree 9er 8-9er out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds AGPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And we're back, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. We're having a conversation with Fred Gedrich, who is a foreign policy and national security analyst. And his resume speaks to those bona fides because he did serve the U.S. government in both the State Department and the Department of Defense. And while in those roles, he did travel extensively on assignments. And so we're kind of validating whatever it was that Trump said a week or so ago about, some of these countries, whatever derogatory remark it was, either about Africa or Haiti. So Fred has been kind enough to tell us, because he's been there firsthand, on what it's really like. He wrote a piece over in Breitbart, and he actually, I think, is going to do it in 2 segments, but the first one was really speaking to Africa and the African Union. And as we went to break, he told us that he was in Mozambique shopping, broad daylight, and was a victim of a crime of theft by machete, I guess, huh?
It was a gleaming dagger, and I could still see it gleaming in the sunlight. It was actually Johannesburg, South Africa.
Oh, okay.
Mozambique.
All right.
And by the way, when we got to Mozambique, we checked in our hotel, and they were in the midst of a civil war at the time.
Oh, swell.
And you check into your room, you close the door, you check out under the bed and everything, and all of a sudden gunfire breaks out on the hill. And so I looked at my colleague, I said, wow, what a trip this is turning out to be. But anyway, Haiti is an interesting place too, and that was part of the conversation last week and President Trump denied making a derogatory remark, and I give him the benefit of doubt on that one, and several other people. I think Senator Dick Durbin and Senator Lindsey Graham, one a Democrat, one a Republican, were trying to make hay out of it. And what was said, we'll never know, I guess, because it has been disputed. But when it comes to Haiti, which is in the Western Hemisphere, the thing that really breaks your heart about that place is when you go there, and the capital city of Port-au-Prince, and the smell because of the open waters, it's just indescribable. It's so bad. And then the harbor is just, the waterfront is just littered with garbage, and everything flows in there. And just walking along there, it's just sad. But the thing that gets me about that part of the world is Haiti shares an island with the Dominican Republic, and Haiti is 1/3 of the island. And the Dominican Republic, just to give you a little example, the population is exactly the same as it is in Haiti, except they have a much better GDP. I would say maybe 4 times per capita. Their life expectancy is 78 years, and their literacy rate is 92. Now, you go to Haiti, and you see that, not only 60% of the population live below the poverty level of, $2.41 a day?
Mm-hmm.
And the extreme poverty level, that's 24% of the people, is $1.23 per day. So to give you an idea of how economically depressed that country is. And then you look at the life expectancy. In Haiti, it's only 64 years, 14 years less than the Dominican Republic. And the literacy rate in Haiti, it's 61%. So 39% of the population can't read or write. And in the Dominican Republic, it's 92% of the population can read or write. So why are things so much better on the other side of the island than it is in Haiti? And I think we know all the reason. Poor governance and a whole lot of other things caused this.
And I would say the UN has actually got, that's the only country, I think, that has a satellite UN office there, correct?
Well, they did, and they've downgraded their presence.
Oh, okay.
They haven't recently left. But a lot was done, and I was there right before President Clinton and the Black Caucus decided to restore democracy. It was after the first coup. And I just shook my head when I heard those words being used in the debate. But as a good government servant, you just try to do your best, right, under the circumstances. And they're really bad there. And I would say Port-au-Prince, the capital city, the most populated city in Haiti, is basically a shanty town. And they have a high incidence, percentage-wise, in the Western Hemisphere. They have the greatest percentage of 8 cases per population. But they had also tuberculosis was rampant there, and a number of other highly infectious diseases. But the slavery and the servitude, and it's the one place in the world, and I read about this in Reader's Digest years ago, about the poor children. The poor parents sell their children in servitude to even other poor families. And, they wind up doing domestic chores, and they're supposed to be fed and educated, but that's not necessarily the case. But the numbers are what's really striking. 208, and this you can find in the Congressional Research Service report on Haiti, December 2017, 286,000 children work in the domestic servitude. That's just shocking. And 1 in 4 children do not live with their biological parents. And amidst all that poverty and all the other problems, the earthquakes, the governments, the coups, and everything else, the hurricanes, and to think, how do we start to get Haiti
stabilized?
Yeah. How do we begin? We've been trying 100 years, though, and it hasn't worked.
Well, and that's kind of where I want to go, because it's obvious that whatever Trump said, good, bad, or indifferent, there was true validity to whatever words he used, because if there wasn't, we wouldn't have countless NGOs, non-government organizations like the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation. We wouldn't have the foreign aid. We wouldn't have USAID. We wouldn't have the UN. We wouldn't have the Millennium Challenge. We wouldn't have Samaritan's Purse. I mean, we could just go on and on and on and on and on of all the money and all the organizations that leave the United States to go. I don't know. I don't want to. They want to help these countries, but they're not making any headway, Fred.
Well, here Aristide had 2 bites at the apple, and neither one turned out well for the Haitian people. And he got in office with a minority vote of poor people. It's basically how he went in. But things stick out. It's mostly a Roman Catholic country. They have 2 official religions. You never guess what the second official religion is in Haiti. it's voodoo. And you can see that right on the CIA World Factbook. And you just shake your head. That was in 2003. They made it official, declared it, the government, voodoo, an official religion. And you know you want to help them. And the U.S. has certainly done its part. We've invested so much money over the years in Haiti. And even, I think I saw a statistic, it was in 1980, there were about 5,000 Haitians in the U.S., and currently there's on the order of 2 million. That's, you know, we've taken in a lot of it. Yeah, and there's a question of, you know, 100, 200,000 that are in the temporary protective status now and what to do with them. But the fact is, we can't take them all. And my thoughts on it are, it's the UN is so inept. They've been trying in Africa, and you know, they've been unsuccessful in everything they've done over the years. And but somehow the Organization of American States has to pick up the ball. The rich countries and chip in. The United States can, you know, we're the biggest benefactor by far, but it can't be all on our shoulders. And somehow the place has to be rebuilt. And you would like to think that after the hurricane, when so many good-hearted people contributed something on the order of $15 billion to help the Haitians out, and that didn't help because things are just as bad as they had been prior to the earthquake. And then they had Hurricane Matthew, and I find it hard when you have basically an illiterate, a substantially illiterate population, to somehow get them on track. And certainly what they need is some enterprises down there to help the people do some meaningful work so they can, you know, take pride in their local communities and their country and hopefully get it on the right track and going. And I can see the U.S. helping out, but there does come a point, and it's actually the same point as the African countries. The President of the United States has an obligation to protect the citizens. That's his most sacred duty, to protect the citizens of the United States. And we just can't take them all in, but we can certainly try to work and help the Haitians out. No, we do have a U.S. embassy down there. Aid is heavily involved, and we're trying real hard, but nothing seems to work. And again, it's you know, we've been dealing with this problem for 100 years, and at some point in time, something has to be, you know, done constructively to make it a better place for its own citizens. And it's
Fred,
sad.
we allow these people to come into the United States. I mean, you just said we've got 2 million Haitians, and we've got Sudanese, and we've got, you know, Somalians here and whatnot. I'm really rather stunned that there's no allegiance, there's no loyalty of these people back to their home country, that once they come here and they understand our system, they understand free enterprise, they understand the rule of law, they understand governance, that some of these people wouldn't want to have some kind of a mission/delegation to go back to these home countries and sort of become their own humanitarian free enterprise envoys, because they can relate to these people because they are Haitians or they are Somalians or they are Sudanese, and we're not. You know, I'm just real. You know, somebody sent me a text message last night that, you know, we've got these protests going on in and around the United States where you've got all of these Latinos and they're holding up the Mexican flag and they're waving it, yet they don't want to go back. Well, you know, if your pride is in holding that flag, then, you know, is it a misplaced loyalty, or are you just, you know, pulling our chain here? So it's kind of like the Cubans, go back and help your home country fix some of these things, because I think after a while they may resent the United States for the intrusion. Correct?
Right. One of the examples I use is Poland, even though it was under the tight fist of communism for so many years after World War II, and then finally, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they got out from under the tight fist, the rule concept, and they've really progressed over the years. I was over there, and I spoke to you about my trip before.
Yes.
But it's safe walking the streets. Their economy is booming, and they take pride in their own country, and they and yet, in the dealings I've had with some of the Polish people here in the U.S. is they consider themselves Polish Americans. Those born here are certainly Americans first, though, but they're also pride in the country of their ancestors, and but that seems to be absent in the case of some people that really come in from poor countries, because they have very little positive to relate to go back. In fact, they want to leave for good, and maybe in some cases forget. And there are others who we see them demonstrating. They carry the flag and everything, and of other countries, and that sort of has generates a mixed feeling with me, because if you're coming here, you're benefiting, and if you want to be a citizen, or if you are a citizen, you owe loyalty to the United States of America, and first. And if you have relatives elsewhere, you try to help them out, improve their lives as much as you can. But to try to demand certain things from a duly elected government, it's one thing to demonstrate. It's another thing to get on the verge of rioting and denigrate others who are, just trying to lead a normal life. And it's a complicated world, and I really appreciate the time and the opportunities I had, both with the Department of State and Department of Defense, to travel the world extensively and see how other people live, and a lot of the problems they face. And every time it was time for me to come home, and when I got home, I just pinched myself, because I realized we are so fortunate. We were born and blessed to be citizens of the United States of America, and free to do almost anything we want, and to make our future based on what we want it to be. And dreams really come through here for those who really have dreams. But you have to first and foremost, strive to be an American if you're an immigrant wanting to stay in the United States and be loyal to our country.
Well, nobody wants, a humanitarian crisis really anywhere in the world. Nobody wants to see that kind of suffering. Nobody wants for people to be illiterate and not to have a chance at something, or at least if they don't have a chance at something, they can have some kind of, we don't want people to suffer, I guess is really what I want to say. I mean, we don't want that. Mm-hmm. And I'm a big believer in a high tide, all boats rise. Mm-hmm. And so when you consider the human resources that we send to these countries through, all of the divisions of our own government that we fund, and then through the monies that, the State Department puts in there and USAID puts in there, the United Nations and, the peacekeeping things and the specific foreign aid. I know that the George Bush administration did a lot of those things too. The Millennium Challenge. I gotta wonder where are some of our allies? I mean, what is the UK doing, or what is Ireland doing, or what is Brazil doing? Are they any of these others taking some kind of a attention target into any of these countries?
Yeah, and I've during my post-government career, I had an opportunity to go and attend a few of the UN global summits, one in Monterrey, Mexico on financing. And basically that's money, going from developed countries to the undeveloped countries. And then I attended a big UN global summit in Johannesburg, South Africa. And that was on the environment. They call it sustainability.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see how the leaders of the world, and most of the world leaders attended both of these summits, and I got to see them. But what I was particularly interested in is the reactions of the assemblage. That's the representatives of all these countries and the NGOs and the non-government organization representatives that have a stake in financing and the environment and everything else. And in Monterrey, Mexico, the loudest and most enthusiastic reception was for Fidel Castro.
Okay.
And he went up and his stick was to just criticize the developed countries because he was an avowed communist.
Mm-hmm.
But what was shocking is to see how well it played to the assemblage. And at that moment, you realize that everything we've been taught or believed, perhaps, is being challenged in these forums. And I just left there shaking my head. And then you had the different cast of characters from the United States who like nothing better than to criticize the United States. They have a heavy presence in those forums too. But in South Africa, Johannesburg, at that global summit, the same thing happened. And I saw Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State at the time. He got up and he talked about freedom, democracy, respect for human rights, and the rule of law. And he was booed and jeered. And following him on the rostrum was none other than the ex-dictator of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe. And you would think a tyrant like that would be someone that the crowd would not appreciate. I was shocked beyond belief when he stood up there and all he said was comrades, and they erupted. They were standing on their chairs yelling. And he proceeded to bash the United States and Great Britain and the other Western countries. And he's an old communist, and that's how he felt. But I never dreamt that he would be that popular amongst the majority of people at that assembly. And it gave me an appreciation of what the world is really like. There's
it's ugly.
A lot of envy out there, and that's why the U.S. has to be extremely careful in our relationships with other countries, because instinctively, I think the Americans are good-hearted and they want to help, like the countries in Africa and Haiti. But when you go in, you may think you're helping, but you might wind up antagonizing someone.
Yeah.
And you have people who are similar in thinking, like Mugabe, who may take advantage of anything the U.S. or the former colonialists do in Africa, ostensibly for the good of the people. because they could find something wrong with it. And it's really a bottomless pit as far as trying to resolve all these problems.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, in Africa you got 54 countries, so you go in and trying to help one and a whole bunch of others. Just like Libya, we went in, tried to. I guess President Obama and Hillary Clinton were trying to do something good. They thought was the Libyan people, but it set off a vicious cycle and the creation of more terrorist groups and more anarchy and more killing. And
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with Fred Gedrich, and he's kind of laid out a full presentation on why there are some real hellholes across the globe. He's seen them firsthand, and certainly with the work that he did both at the Defense Department and the State Department. Fred, thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience, and thanks for your service, and come back again real soon, sir.
Will do. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you. All right. More coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us.
Hi, thank you for listening. My name is Ron Phillips, and I'm the owner and operations manager of Talk America Radio. It is with great pride that I offer you these two 24/7 streams of some of the finest talk radio programming in the country, but I need your support. Talk America Radio is a listener-supported network. That means we need your help to continue to offer the quality programming you're hearing right now. Please visit talkamericaradio.us and click the Support Us button. You can contribute monthly or send us a one-time amount. We'll put it to good use continuing to share the American voice. Thank you.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
ATA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia, and WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for our staying with us here on our last segment on the Denise Simon Experience. Betrayal at Bethesda, a book by J.C. Hawkins. J.C. has been kind enough to send the book to me and join us here to discuss some things, because he's got 3 interesting names in this book. And I don't want to steal all the thunder, but J.C., thanks so much for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Well, it's certainly my pleasure.
You've got James Forrestal, you've got Joseph McCarthy, and you've got John F. Kennedy. And you kind of merge some commonalities in your book, Betrayal at Bethesda. What in the world made you start asking some internal questions and poking around and writing this book?
Over a period of time, I've been very much fascinated by the whole history of the post-World War II era. And in reading a number of different texts, it came across to me that there were some connections among these three leaders. In the aftermath of World War II, global communism was on the rise with the success the Soviet Union enjoyed in negotiating its position at Yalta. And there were three leaders who stepped forward to serve as the vanguard in taking on global communism. And interestingly enough, it was this trio, James Forrestal, Joe McCarthy, and Jack Kennedy. And I started seeing what was the motivations for the three of them to do that, and then in the process found there were a lot of connections among them.
Well, do you mean connections, or there were a lot of similar conditions or similar things that happened? I mean, did they really know each other?
They absolutely knew each other and knew each other well. Forrestal, who was the first Secretary of Defense, actually served as a mentor.
Oh, that's right. That's
McCarthy
right.
and Kennedy.
That's right. What was the most shocking thing that in your research that you came across?
I don't know if I would say it was shocking, but certainly surprising at what a staunch anti-communist JFK was. And when he first ran for Congress in 1946, how he pegged his whole campaign theme to being the fighting conservative. And naturally, he played on his heroics in World War II to help bolster that image as a, staunch pro-military defense conservative.
Mm-hmm. Well, McCarthy, he certainly was. We even have an era that is named for him. And even in today's world, that we see that there are those that are challenging Joe McCarthy, aren't they? And his
Joe
work.
McCarthy was immediately attacked by the left for his staunch anti-communism, and he was certainly a vocal critic, and he undertook hearings in the Senate to ferret out what he thought was the communist infiltration of the United States government. And at that time, he was joined by then Congressman Kennedy in terms of excoriating some of the leadership in the American government for its turning a blind eye to this infiltration.
And Forrestal, you're going to have to give the audience a little bit of a history on Forrestal, because that really kind of takes us back, I think, to where most of the listeners would not even remember that name.
Right. He served as Secretary of the Navy during World War II, and he, in that time, became convinced that the Soviet Union was a growing threat, that they were getting too many concessions from both Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill at the various conferences. The leaders had to map out the strategy for World War II. And he also became aware of the fact that there were people within the Roosevelt administration, very high-ranking people, who were clearly working on behalf of the Soviet Union. And when he tried to raise this issue with President Truman after the death of FDR, he ran into something of a brick wall, because Truman didn't want to, delve into that and open that can of worms.
We're kind of still there today, aren't we?
There certainly is what you would call kindly a very strong left-wing influence throughout the government. And one of the places that it's been most pronounced since the end of World War II has been the State Department. And in fact, in my book, I have an appendix, and it's Appendix A, in which I list 132 individuals in the World War II and then Cold War era who were very clearly identified as communists or very strong communist sympathizers who held very high positions throughout the United States government in that era. And this list was put together based on research by a number of prominent people, including former President Herbert Hoover, and then other authors and historians, as well as the FBI, and then people who finally had access to KGB files. And to my knowledge, this list is a compendium of the work of a number of people, but the first time these people have all been put into one list.
I see some interesting names in here. Some that I kind of thought I knew some things, and after I see your list, I've decided I don't. The more I know, the dumber I am, because there are certainly some names in here that have missed my radar altogether. Are there any in here that in this list that were especially worrisome for you?
Oh, absolutely. Harry Hawkins was a key assistant to President Roosevelt and relied on by the president so heavily that he actually lived in the White House. And most people aren't aware of that, but Harry Hopkins lived in the White House and was the key advisor to FDR. And he was, in essence, a liaison to Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. And Stalin really viewed Hopkins as his key ally in the American government in terms of influencing policy. Another would be Harry Dexter White, who was an assistant in the Treasury Department to Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. And as readers will see in the book, White played a role in the debacle that ultimately happened at Pearl Harbor in terms of influencing policy toward Japan that would, in essence, wind up provoking the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where does JC, where does Bethesda fit into all of this? Are you referring to the Naval Hospital?
Yes, it's the National Naval Medical Center at Bethesda, which has, if most people were asked what they know about it, they would just know that it is rated very highly as a medical facility, and it's where the president goes and the senators go and high-ranking military go for their medical care. And interestingly enough, it's where, in a 14-year span, James Forrestal, Joe McCarthy, and Jack Kennedy, their dead bodies all wound up in the morgue at Bethesda, with both Forrestal and McCarthy actually dying there, and Kennedy coming there to have an autopsy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what struck me kind of right between the eyes, that there were these three men who had very strong interpersonal connections. And within a 14-year period, they all wound up dead in the same place, with two of them actually dying there under certainly suspicious circumstances.
Yeah. You make reference to the the Warren Commission report, and certainly to this list of operatives within our government. I appreciate the questions that you in some of the planting of some seeds that you have in this book, because it really speaks to all the things that we think, and we're not too thrilled about saying them out there publicly, because people will say, well, yeah, there was this and there was this, and we're supposed to accept what we're being told, and you're not accepting that, are you?
Not at all. Actually, when I look back on the book and put it in the context of what we're experiencing today, we see evidence that in this time period of the emergence of the deep state, and certainly the impact of fake news, because the way the deaths of these men were reported certainly was less than what I would consider the truth. And there were people involved who deliberately smeared these men because they didn't want anybody to really dig into their deaths and what really happened.
Well, today we're missing emails and servers, I might add, but I would also argue, and I think that you allude to this too, that we still have documents out there. One, either we don't know that we even have missing documents because we don't know what was there that would have necessarily been missing, or two, if they exist, some are still classified even after 50 years. And that really is an outrage, isn't it, JC?
Well, one of the things that a lot of people were totally unaware of is that when Forrestal died, the Navy commissioned a review board to investigate the circumstances of his death. And an Admiral Wilcox was put in charge of the review board. And over about maybe a half-year period of time, they came up with their report, which didn't have much in the way of conclusions other than the fact that the man died, and they don't know why or how, other than he went out a window in the 16th floor and landed on the ground. That report was never released to the public. All that was released was a summary at the time. And it wasn't until in the 1990s, through the efforts of independent researchers, that the Wilcox report was finally released in its entirety. And it raised a lot of interesting questions. And I explore some of that in my book, and have since found additional information related to that would indicate the whole story of James Forrestal committing suicide is just specious nonsense.
Did you file any FOIA requests to help you with some of your research, and was it forthcoming?
I did file a FOIA request with what was once the Naval Hospital and now has been renamed Walter Reed Hospital at Bethesda. And I made the mistake of sending it through the U.S. mail, but not having it, registered as such. And the priority mail was never delivered. It got lost somewhere along the line in transit. And I thought at that time it probably got there, and they just
said that.
Forget it. And what I had requested was anything related to the medical treatment of Senator McCarthy, any of the notes on his conditions during the course of his stay, who the physicians might have been who were treating him, and so on. And, of course, none of that information was forthcoming, and I'm still making an effort to get to that, because the report the hospital issued upon his death raised more questions than it answered. It said he died from acute hepatitis, but it was non-infectious. Well, if it was non-infectious, that can mean only one thing, that Joe McCarthy was exposed to some sort of toxin that basically poisoned him. And the story that was put out through the media immediately was that he was an alcoholic and he drunk himself to death, that alcohol was the toxin. But there is plenty of other information that indicates, he enjoyed a drink like a lot of folks did, but he didn't appear at the hospital with any sign of cirrhosis or any kind of alcoholic poisoning. He was admitted to the hospital with a knee injury and what you would call neuritis in his knee. And that was quickly changed to a diagnosis of hepatitis. And if you have hepatitis, it would be readily apparent to the most junior resident physician that you have hepatitis. It's not neuritis that brought you here.
So was this a Soviet thing? Was it an insider thing? Was it a Chinese thing? What is your gut telling you?
The possibilities are endless, but there was ample evidence, if you will, that he had made serious enemies in the CIA, because after he turned his attention on the State Department, he tried to go after people in the CIA that he thought were
un-American.
Un-American. And that was thwarted at every turn, thanks to the efforts of President Eisenhower, who got people in his administration to try and work against McCarthy's efforts and directly persuade him that this was a bad idea, that it would jeopardize national security. The usual excuses given for why you can't look into this. So it was a way to cover it all up. But there were people, certainly within the CIA, who more than once voiced the opinion that, hey, we need to get rid of this guy. He's getting to be a real pain in the neck.
In CIA or even OSS, I would say, not necessarily doing things nefariously, but it would, and maybe they were, but when you have to do covert work, you end up having to sleep with the devil here. And a lot of those things they didn't want to necessarily come out. Maybe McCarthy was getting a little too close to all of that, you think?
He got way too close for comfort. And again, in my Appendix A, I have a list of people who started out with the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, during World War II. And then once the CIA was formed, they either went into the CIA or into the State Department. And these were people who, some were very clearly communists or certainly allied with communists. And a number of them wound up in CIA, and you have to wonder how far they burrowed into that organization and were able to do things, not necessarily at the direction of the leadership, but as rogue agents who took it upon themselves to do certain things.
For the reader, it almost, we have a section of our population called the millennials. And they're not taught this kind of stuff, are they? I would say, your book's not very long. I would say that this would be a fascinating presentation to a civics class or a U.S. history class, because I don't think it's taught there. And you're I can see you, JC, doing a presentation here such that they would almost self-assign them some work for themselves to take it a little bit further. Do you think that's true?
That's part of the intent of the book. I didn't intend it to be a totally scholarly, academic treatise, if you will, because, there was simply not the time to go down that road. But I thought the basic theory and premise I had was important enough that I needed to get it presented and get it out there and get it on the table. And in essence, let others pick it up and run with it to see where, if something catches their eye or fascinates them, they might take it further. And I'm taking it further as well. I've had new information turn up since the book published. I've had people come to me and say, "Are you aware of this?"
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I thought, gosh, I wish I could have put that in the book. But I just wanted to get the story out there and say, here's what I'm saying I think happened, and I think I can back it up fairly compellingly with what I present in the book. And it's for others to join in as well and challenge the conventional wisdom which is out there. And certainly the educational system is not going to present this readily unless they're kind of pushed into it. And I've got feelers out to different places to see if I might go in and speak to, a college history class or politics class. And do it in the context of what we're seeing now in terms of the deep state and fake news.
Well, you're not trying to rewrite history. You're just challenging what has been published, because a lot of history is just, you say it enough and it's supposed to be true, but some of it isn't even proven. It's myths become part of legend. And all you're doing is kind of challenging some of these, issues, correct?
Correct. The whole idea of McCarthyism, I had a email exchange back and forth with a liberal individual in the news media, and she called me a McCarthyite, and I thanked her for the compliment. If you take the time to seriously dig into it, you'll find Joe McCarthy was about 90% right in everything he did.
Mm-hmm.
But he was smeared by the news media who were in the hip pocket of the CIA. And the CIA had an operation called Operation Mockingbird, in which they basically co-opted some of the leading media people at the time to get them to take on their particular spin and discredit people like Forrestal, McCarthy, and even JFK.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Drew Pearson was the one who was really the biggest proponent of that. He smeared Forrestal and McCarthy very viciously, and then he put out the story, which turned out to be false, that JFK didn't write profiles in courage, where the old man Kennedy, Joe Kennedy, wanted to sue Pearson for $50 million.
Well, the book is it is really provocative, and it makes everybody kind of sit back and go, "Oh yeah," or "Oh really," and it makes you want to take some notes. I'm a big proponent of putting Post-it notes on certain pages, so you'd laugh at some of the books I have that are full of Post-it notes, and yours will clearly be one of them, because you kind of want to go, oh, maybe I ought to go a little bit further in this one. And I hope maybe that you need to write a volume 2 to this.
Well, I'm already underway.
I had a feeling you were. with some FOIAs that actually get there. Yeah.
Point out very quickly, I ran across a quote from Joe McCarthy that absolutely floored me. And it was from September 23rd, 1950. He was speaking about the Yalta Conference at the end of World War II. And if I could just read the short quote, "Here was signed the death warrant of the young men who are dying today in the hills and valleys of Korea. Here was signed the death warrant of the young men who will die tomorrow in the jungles of Indochina." Mm-hmm. He had enough vision to see where this was going in terms of Vietnam.
I was just going to say Vietnam.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. Now, this is a guy who's presented by what I like to call the elite trader media as a troglodyte and a Neanderthal, and yet in 1950, he could see what was going to happen in terms of Vietnam.
Quite insightful. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with J.C. Hawkins, and the book is Betrayal at Bethesda, The Intertwined Fates of James Forrestal, Joseph McCarthy, and John F. Kennedy. So happy that you wrote this, and so happy that you could kind of share some time with us on this. And I'm gonna push you to hurry up and do the volume 2.
I'm already at work, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity to share some of these insights with you and your listeners.
Good deal. Thank you, and come back soon.
Well, anytime you want, I'll be happy to do it.
All right, good deal. Thank you, and thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.